I found my husband's original birth certificate and realized I wasn't marrying the person I thought or the name I knew. We had been married for 8 years, but our relationship dated back a decade. 10 years with the man I knew as Daniel James Peterson. He was everything stable in my life, a financial planner, organized, quiet, and deeply committed to our life in the city. I was Sarah, an art teacher, spontaneous and a little messy. He was my anchor. Our life was comfortable, if a bit predictable. We had two beautiful daughters, aged 6 and 8, and we lived the textbook definition of a quiet, stable, upper middle class life. Robert was my rock. He was meticulous, honest, almost painfully conventional, or so I believed. I would often joke that Daniel was the one who kept my feet on the ground, the solid, dependable man who managed the complexity of adulthood so I could enjoy the simpler things. That perception of his unwavering honesty was the very thing that protected his lie for so long. The discovery was entirely accidental. A mundane chore turned into a cosmic horror. Daniel and I were refinancing our mortgage, which required a stack of original documents. Daniel was usually meticulous with paperwork, keeping every receipt and contract filed alphabetically, but he had been traveling for work. I volunteered to sort through the fireproof safe in his home office. I had always trusted him implicitly with the financials. The safe was complex, and I had never opened it before, not because it was forbidden, but because I never felt the need. I felt like an intruder just touching the dial. Inside, beneath tax returns and our daughter's immunization records, I found a small, worn leather wallet I had never seen. It was old, scuffed, and clearly not Daniel's style. He favored sleek, modern accessories. It felt foreign and heavy in my hand. Inside the wallet were three things: a faded, grainy photograph of a young boy who looked exactly like our eldest daughter, a social security card, and a birth certificate. The document stopped my breathing. It wasn't the document that was shocking. It was the content. It was issued 37 years ago in a small town in rural Ohio. The name listed was David Ethan Walker. The father's name was listed as Robert Walker. The mother's name was Elizabeth Walker. The date of birth matched Daniel's date of birth exactly. But the names of the parents, the entire history, it was fundamentally wrong. My husband's name was Daniel James Peterson. His parents, whom I spoke to every Sunday for 8 years, were George and Linda Peterson, living comfortably in Florida. My first thought was a mistake, a long-lost brother who died young, perhaps, an adoption story he had never told me, a witness protection program, maybe, something fantastical to explain the sheer terror building in my chest. But the Social Security card in the same wallet was also issued under the name David Ethan Walker, and the numbers were different from the ones Daniel used on our taxes. I knew, with a bone-deep certainty that chilled me to the core, that I wasn't looking at a sibling's past. I was looking at my husband's stolen identity. He wasn't Daniel. He was David. I sat in his office chair, the world spinning in slow motion. David Ethan Walker. Who was he? Who were his parents? And why, for the entire 10 years I'd known him, had he built our life, our entire beautiful, safe illusion under a lie? The implications were staggering. If he lied about his name and his parents, what else was a lie? Our finances? His supposed college degree? The very legality of our marriage? Every memory we shared, our first date, our wedding vows, the moment he held our first daughter, was now tainted, based on a foundation of sand. I went through every document in the safe again, looking for clothes, my fingers frantic against the cold paper. I found a second, smaller safe, about the size of a jewelry box, hidden behind a bookshelf where Daniel kept his dense tax manuals. It required a code I didn't know, but I knew the truth was locked inside, and that truth was far more devastating than a simple name change. Over the next few days, while Daniel was away, I became a detective in my own home. I used his locked office computer, guessing his password. It was our anniversary date. A painful irony. I ran David Ethan Walker through public record searches, focusing on the small town in Ohio listed on the birth certificate. The search results were sparse, but what I found was chilling. A cold breath of police sirens from 20 years ago. I found a newspaper clipping from 20 years ago. Teenager, David Walker, goes missing after fatal car accident. The article detailed a drunk driving crash that killed David's best friend, with David listed as the driver who fled the scene. He was 17 at the time. The body of the deceased friend was found days later in the wreckage. The article ended with a plea from the police to David Walker to turn himself in. He was gone, vanished without a trace, suspected of manslaughter and fleeing the state. I stumbled back, dropping the printout, the paper fluttering to the floor like a wounded bird. My husband wasn't just hiding an identity change. He was hiding from a fatal crime. He hadn't changed his name for a fresh start. He had changed his name to escape the law, to escape jail time, and to escape the crippling legacy of having killed his best friend. I looked at our wedding photos on the wall. The smiling, dependable Nan who promised to love me forever was a fugitive. Every time he went on a business trip, was he looking over his shoulder? Every time he discouraged me from moving to a new state, was it because he was worried about border checks and extradition? I was married to a man who murdered my peace. That night, Daniel came home, kissed me as usual, and asked if I had sorted the documents. I looked him in the eye, my voice shaking with a cold rage I couldn't contain, fueled by the image of his dead friend. Yes, Daniel, I found the documents. I found David Ethan Walker, too. The color drained from his face instantly, replaced with a gray, sickly pallor as he realized his 20-year fortress had crumbled. The man I knew as Daniel was gone, and standing before me was the desperate, trapped man named David. I remained standing, needing the physical height to keep the rage from dragging me down into his pity. The air in the office was thick with the scent of old paper and the metallic tang of fear, a horrifying bouquet for the destruction of my marriage. He looked at the birth certificate, then at the floor, unable to meet my eyes, and the silence stretched until the faint sound of our children playing upstairs broke the tension. He needed to speak. I needed to hear the lie unravel. He started with Michael. He was my brother, David whispered, his voice cracking. Not by blood, but by every other measure. His death was immediate. The accident. It was my fault. I was driving, I was drunk, and I was going too fast. He described the cold realization of what he had done, the siren sounds approaching in the distance, and the absolute, paralyzing terror of facing jail. He was 17 and facing 2 decades behind bars for killing his best friend. He drove away through the back roads, abandoning the wreckage, abandoning his life, abandoning Michael's body. He ran until he reached the state line, using cash and instinct, propelled by the desperate belief that if he got far enough, the crime would simply cease to exist. He spent the next year in the bleak anonymity of small Midwestern towns, washing dishes, sleeping in shelters, existing as a ghost. His guilt, he swore, was a constant physical companion, a stone in his stomach. It was during this period that he arrived in a quiet suburb of Michigan and met George and Linda Peterson. They owned a small hardware store and had recently lost their own son, Daniel James Peterson, in a freak climbing accident, a detail that I knew from our early innocent conversations. David had been working as a temporary stock boy. The Petersons, heartbroken and deeply lonely, saw in David a resemblance, a ghost, a chance for a do-over. They never asked about his past. They saw his quiet sadness as grief, not guilt. He explained how the deception began slowly, organically. They started calling him Danny. They bought him clothes, fed him. Then a few months later, they presented the offer. They gave me Daniel's papers, David admitted, the words tasting like ash. His social security card, his birth certificate, his college applications. They said their real son was gone. They wanted a son. And I desperately wanted to stop running. It was the ultimate Faustian bargain. They coached him on Daniel's history, Daniel's favorite things, Daniel's friends. They provided him with the clean slate, the college education funding, and the entire identity of Daniel James Peterson, allowing David Walker, the fugitive, to finally vanish. I felt physically sick hearing the confirmation of George and Linda's complicity. My sweet, elderly in-laws, they were the architects of my nightmare. All those Sunday calls, those gentle smiles, those family dinners were participants in a massive, cold-blooded fraud. They lied to me about everything, I choked out, tears finally blurring my vision, tears not of sadness, but of pure, white-hot fury. They watched me marry a man who wasn't their son and knew he was a killer who had run from justice. They were the safe harbor for a criminal. He insisted they did it out of love, out of grief, not malice. But his defense only highlighted the staggering arrogance of his control. He believed his love for me was enough to justify stealing my reality. He never considered the moral danger he placed me in, the legal risk to our children, or the devastation I would feel when the truth surfaced. I asked him the most painful question, the one that tore through the pretense of our love. Why me? Why marry me? Why have children with me, knowing I would be the final innocent victim if this ever came out? Did you ever even love Sarah Sullivan, or did you just need a wife for the Daniel Peterson character? He broke down then, shaking violently. He swore his love for me was the only real thing in his life, the only non-stolen commodity. He claimed that was why he took so many precautions. He never wanted the truth to hurt me. He wept openly, clutching his head, begging for forgiveness and understanding. But I couldn't see Daniel Peterson, the loving husband. I only saw David Walker, the reckless teenager who left his friend to die, and the selfish adult who used my entire life as his final camouflage. I needed to secure the safety of our daughters. The legal reality was cold and undeniable. The manslaughter charge from 20 years ago was barred by the statute of limitations. He could not be charged with that crime. But the crime of fleeing the scene of a fatal accident and the subsequent identity fraud, those statutes had not expired. He could still face serious jail time, possibly 5 to 10 years, for evading justice and using stolen identification. The stability he had promised was a ticking bomb, and it needed to be deactivated. The choice was clear, agonizingly so. The man who was David had to face justice, not just for Michael, but for the 10 years of my life he had stolen. I owed the truth to the man whose name he stole, to the Petersons who were complicit, and most importantly, to my own sanity and the safety of my children. I had to end the lie no matter the cost to our family. The choice wasn't about saving Daniel Peterson. It was about burying David Walker once and for all and reclaiming the life he had stolen from me. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of meticulous, agonizing calculation. I wasn't weeping, I was simply functioning to dismantle my life. I knew I couldn't call the authorities until I spoke to the Petersons, George and Linda. They had to know that their secret, which they had foisted onto me, was coming to an end. It was the only shred of loyalty I had left for the family I thought they were. I drove the 3 hours to their retirement community in absolute silence. When I arrived, they greeted me with their usual gentle warmth, asking about the girls and about Daniel's last business trip. The hypocrisy was a physical blow. I sat them down at their sun-drenched kitchen table, pulled out the worn wallet containing the David Walker documents, and placed it between us. "I know about David," I stated, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I know about Michael and the accident. And I know about Daniel James Peterson. He wasn't your son. He was a fugitive you adopted to replace him. And you put your name on a marriage certificate that tied a criminal to my life and the lives of your grandchildren." Linda gasped, clutching her chest, tears streaming instantly. George, however, looked away, his jaw rigid. He didn't deny it. He just looked out the window at the manicured lawn, admitting nothing but confirming everything. He finally said, with a strained, low voice, "It was necessary, Sarah. He was a good boy. He deserved a second chance. We just wanted a son back." Their selfishness, their decision to trade a fugitive for a dead child, regardless of the consequences for the innocent people in the new life, was monumental. I laid out the legal reality. The manslaughter charge was safe, but the identity fraud and evading justice were not. I told them I was calling the authorities. Linda pleaded with me, begging me not to destroy the life they had rebuilt, sobbing that Daniel was all they had left. George finally faced me, his eyes empty. "You will do what you must, Sarah, but you are destroying this family. Remember that." I left their house knowing I had just severed my last painful connection to the man who was Daniel. The drive back was unbearable, but the hardest part was yet to come. I called the local police department in Ohio, asking for the cold case detective who handled the Michael Thompson file. The moment I spoke the name David Ethan Walker and the details of the 20-year-old hit and run, the investigator's voice sharpened with stunned focus. I gave them the full story, the confession, the identity theft, and Daniel's current whereabouts. I was calm, clinical, providing every detail they needed to prove the fraud and secure the arrest. The arrest happened early the next morning. Daniel, or David, was taken away from our house in silence, still wearing the suit he wore to his fake financial planning job. The girls were thankfully at school. I watched the police car drive away, the physical weight of the lie finally lifting from my shoulders, replaced by the crushing weight of reality. The stability was gone. The fortress had collapsed. The aftermath was a brutal lesson in reconstruction. Our marriage was voided due to fraud. The legal identity of Daniel James Peterson ceased to exist, replaced by the fugitive David Walker, who was extradited to Ohio to face charges for evading justice. I had to change the girl's last name back to my maiden name, a painful but necessary step to sever the criminal link. Explaining the loss of their father to my young daughter